It all started with what I thought was a routine letter from the HOA. I remember coming home one afternoon, a little worn out from work, and seeing that familiar envelope with the HOA's logo glaring at me from the mailbox. Normally, these letters were just boring newsletters or reminders to trim hedges, but this one felt heavier somehow, like it carried a different weight. When I opened it, I felt my stomach drop. The letter was cold, stiff, and formal. It stated that I was being fined for multiple violations of the community bylaws. The total fine? $72. At first, I actually laughed. Surely, there had to be some mistake. $70,000 isn't a slap on the wrist. It's life-altering money. That's a new car, a big chunk off a mortgage, college tuition. The audacity of the HOA to slap me with something like that felt unreal. But the more I read, the less funny it got. They listed off so-called infractions like weeds growing half an inch too high, a garden shed they claimed violated aesthetic standards, and even a minor crack in my driveway. They itemized everything in painstaking detail, each little complaint attached to hundreds or thousands of dollars in fines. It felt like they'd spent weeks poring over my property, hunting for anything to ding me on. As I stood there on my porch reading it over again, a couple neighbors walked by, giving me these awkward little smiles. They knew. Everyone always knows. In neighborhoods run by HOAs, word travels faster than wildfire. By the next morning, I could feel the shift. Neighbors who used to wave now gave me tight nods or outright looked the other way. It was like they were worried my bad standing might rub off on them if they got too friendly. Meanwhile, I started noticing the HOA patrol cars driving by my house more frequently. They'd slow down, sometimes stopping out front to jot something on clipboard. I even caught one of them taking photos of my property while pretending to check his phone. Then came the second letter. This time it was even more severe. They threatened to place a lien on my house if I didn't pay up. They painted this chilling picture of my home being auctioned off to satisfy the debt. Suddenly, my laughter from that first day felt childish. Now I was genuinely worried. I started digging through the HOA's covenants and restrictions, combing through page after page of dense legal jargon, trying to figure out what kind of power they really had. The more I read, the more I realized how stacked the deck was in their favor. These documents were designed to give them almost unlimited control over homeowners. They could decide, practically on a whim, that your fence color was wrong or your grass was too dry, and then hammer you with fines that ballooned faster than credit card interest. I tried calling one of the board members to talk it out, hoping maybe there was some mistake. Maybe they mixed me up with someone else. But the call went nowhere. He was short with me, borderline smug, like he relished the idea of seeing me sweat. It's all in the bylaws, he kept saying, as if that was supposed to shut me up. They knew most people didn't have the stomach or the cash to fight back. The system was built on intimidation, on residents being too scared or too broke to stand up for themselves. Meanwhile, more letters arrived. Certified mail. Pink slips stuck to my door. I started to dread checking the mailbox altogether. Each time, my pulse would spike, my palms would sweat, and I'd brace myself for the next round of threats. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about humiliation, about power. The HOA wanted to make an example out of me. I could picture them sitting around their little folding tables at monthly meetings, passing my name around, nodding in self-satisfaction about how they were keeping the neighborhood in line. The worst part was seeing how easily people fell in line. Neighbors who used to chat with me on the sidewalk now rushed inside when they saw me coming. It was like I'd become radioactive. Even local contractors seemed wary. One guy canceled a small landscaping job last minute because he didn't want to get mixed up in HOA issues. All the while, that looming figure, $70,000, hung over my head. Every time I tried to relax, watch a show, or read a book, it crept into my mind. It felt like a vice slowly tightening around my chest. I started running through nightmare scenarios. My house being seized, my credit destroyed, me being forced to pack up and leave the place I'd worked so hard to make my own. I was furious, humiliated, scared, and completely uncertain how far the HOA would actually go or whether I'd ever claw my way out of this mess. Once the fine was made public knowledge, it didn't take long for the entire atmosphere of the neighborhood to shift. It's unsettling how quickly people can change when they smell scandal or trouble lingering near someone's front door. Neighbors I'd known for years, people who used to wave enthusiastically when I'd mow the lawn or stand around chatting with me about the weather, began to keep their distance. Conversations dried up almost overnight. I'd step outside to water the flowers or grab the paper and catch hushed voices floating from across the street, heads turning away too quickly, like they were worried even eye contact might involve them somehow. Meanwhile, the HOA seemed to double their efforts. It was almost like they enjoyed putting on a show of their authority, parading their little power in front of the rest of the community. Board members and their so-called compliance officers started showing up more often, driving slowly down the street with clipboards and cameras, making notes or snapping pictures of my house like it was some local crime scene. I could be standing on my porch or pulling weeds in the garden, and they'd barely acknowledge me, just a curt nod or nothing at all before moving along, eyes scanning for some new alleged violation to pile on. It gave off the distinct feeling that they were hoping to catch me doing something wrong, no matter how trivial, so they could slap me with more penalties. A week later, I got another notice shoved into my mailbox, this time detailing how, since the fines remained unpaid, they were proceeding with preparations to place a lien on my property. They made sure to highlight in bold font how a lien could ultimately lead to foreclosure if left unresolved. The language was cold and clinical, no hint of humanity, like I was just an entry on a spreadsheet somewhere that needed to be processed and pushed along. It was meant to intimidate me, and on some level it worked. The idea of losing my home over these ridiculous claims was enough to keep me up at night, staring at the ceiling, running numbers over and over in my head. It wasn't just the HOA applying pressure. The social ripple effect was real. People in the neighborhood seemed to treat me like a cautionary tale. A couple of kids who used to cut across my lawn on their bikes stopped entirely. Their parents must have warned them off. An older couple who would occasionally drop off fresh vegetables from their garden now simply nodded stiffly from across the street. Even the mail carrier seemed awkward delivering my letters, offering a sympathetic shrug, once like he knew I was the local outcast. The tension didn't stay contained to polite snubs or cold shoulders either. One afternoon, I came home to find a small group gathered by the sidewalk just outside my yard. 3 of the more vocal HOA supporters chatting with a board member in a polo shirt embroidered with the HOA's name. They didn't lower their voices when I pulled into the driveway. I could clearly catch snippets about property values and bad examples, followed by a few dismissive laughs. They paused long enough to watch me walk up to my door, their eyes tracking me with that unmistakable look people give when they're glad someone else is taking the heat, so they don't have to. Every time the HOA's white SUV patrolled by, my dog would start barking, probably sensing the tension that spiked in me each time I spotted it creeping past the house. It felt invasive, almost predatory, like they were circling prey. Even my friends who lived outside the neighborhood started to notice how jumpy I'd become. They'd try to reassure me, joke about those petty HOA busybodies, but it didn't change the fact that I was the one under their microscope. Through it all, the HOA maintained their smug composure. The board would send me emails detailing how they were simply enforcing community standards, reminding me that every homeowner agreed to abide by the covenants when purchasing property. They'd sprinkle in lines about preserving the integrity and aesthetics of the neighborhood, as if cracked sidewalks or a weed or two were somehow existential threats. There was an undercurrent of self-satisfaction in their communication, a barely concealed delight in flexing their power. The longer it went on, the more it became obvious that this wasn't just about rules. It was personal now. The board wanted to prove a point to show the rest of the community what happens when someone dares to question or push back against them. And my neighbors? They seemed all too willing to watch it unfold from the safety of their own porches, whispering behind drawn blinds while my life sat squarely under the HOA's magnifying glass. From the start, it was clear the HOA loved nothing more than brandishing their authority, acting like miniature monarchs ruling over a kingdom of manicured lawns and color-coordinated mailboxes. After hitting me with the outrageous fine, their entire demeanor shifted into something that bordered on smug triumph. They strutted through the neighborhood as if they had personally conquered some rebellion and were now basking in the glory of their victory. Whenever I crossed paths with certain board members, especially the treasurer, who seemed to relish every moment of this saga, they wore these polite, tight-lipped smiles that never quite reached their eyes, like they were silently daring me to defy them further. The HOA meetings became a show of power in their own right. They held them in the small community center by the park, with rows of neatly aligned chairs and a long table at the front where the board presided like a tribunal. Residents would file in, coffee cups in hand, trying to look casual while obviously hungry for the next bit of neighborhood drama. The board would shuffle their papers, adjust microphones, and launch into stiff agendas that always seemed to circle back to preserving property values, the convenient umbrella excuse they use for everything from dictating mailbox height to threatening legal action. At one particular meeting, I decided to attend, thinking I might be able to appeal directly or at least present my side of the story in front of my neighbors. I stood there waiting my turn to speak, hands clenched so tightly around my notes that they crumpled at the edges. When I finally addressed the board, explaining how unreasonable the fines were and how many of the cited violations were either exaggerated or outright fabricated, they listened with carefully practiced indifference. A few board members avoided my eyes altogether, shuffling papers as if I were merely background noise. The treasurer drummed his pen on the table, glancing at the clock more than once. When I finished, he leaned forward and repeated, almost word for word, the same scripted language from the letters they'd sent me. "We are simply upholding community standards, which you agreed to when you purchased your home." That phrase rang in my ears for days. It was their favorite line, the ultimate trump card. As if signing a stack of closing documents years ago meant I had willingly handed over my autonomy to be judged, fined, and humiliated at their whim. They clung to that contract like it was a holy text, waving it around to justify every unreasonable action. And the worst part? Most of the neighbors just accepted it. They'd nod along, grateful the board was taking care of problems, happy to keep their own names out of the crosshairs. Outside of meetings, the HOA ramped up subtle intimidation tactics. I started receiving courtesy calls, which were anything but courteous, reminding me of the growing balance of my fines. The callers used cheerful, almost syrupy tones that only made the underlying threat more chilling. I'd hang up, only to receive a follow-up email a few hours later, reiterating everything in cold legal language. It was a constant drumbeat designed to wear me down, to make me accept that I had no power here. Meanwhile, the HOA newsletter, normally filled with gardening tips and garage sale announcements, started running thinly veiled reminders about the importance of compliance and avoiding actions that forced the association to take serious measures. Though they never named me outright, it was obvious to anyone paying attention who the message was aimed at. It stung to know I'd become the neighborhood cautionary tale, the example they pointed to when reminding everyone else why it was better to toe the line. One afternoon, I came home to find a fresh violation notice taped right to my door at eye level. The HOA logo was proudly emblazoned at the top, followed by a new complaint, this time claiming my outdoor lights were inconsistent with community design standards. I stood there reading it over and over, feeling a strange mix of anger and resignation. They were relentless, probing for any tiny infraction to justify more fines, more leverage. Even walking my dog felt different. I'd see board members doing casual laps around the block, nodding politely to other residents, throwing quick glances my way. It wasn't hard to sense that they were savoring their own sense of control, acting like gatekeepers of order, convinced their rules were sacred and their judgments beyond question. In their minds, I wasn't just a homeowner. I was a problem to be managed, a rebellious mark they intended to bring back into line by whatever means necessary. For weeks, I let the HOA parade around, acting like they owned every inch of the neighborhood, including me. They continued with their smug inspections, piling up fines, sending out stern letters, and using me as their poster child for what happens when someone dares to question their authority. Meanwhile, I kept to myself, nodding politely when necessary, giving them no reason to suspect that behind my calm exterior, something much bigger was brewing. Because while they were busy measuring the length of my grass and photographing microscopic cracks in my driveway, they had absolutely no clue about one critical detail that changed everything. I owned the only road into the entire community. It wasn't some trick or loophole. It was a simple, overlooked fact rooted in local property records. Years ago, when the original developer went bankrupt halfway through building out our subdivision, several parcels, including the main access road, were auctioned off. I'd purchased the land at the time for practically nothing, thinking maybe someday it would be useful or could be sold to the county. I kept up the minimal maintenance obligations, paid the tiny tax bills, and otherwise didn't give it much thought. The HOA certainly never did either, or they would have realized they were driving over private property every single day. As my mailbox filled with threats and liens, I spent my evenings pulling old deeds, tax receipts, and easement documents out of my filing cabinet. I called the county records office to verify everything, double-checking that the legal description of my land and deed included that winding asphalt road stretching from the county highway right up to our neighborhood's decorative stone sign. With every confirmation, my confidence grew. The HOA might think they controlled the gates of this little kingdom, but in reality, the gate stood squarely on my land, and without my consent, none of them had a guaranteed right to pass. I hired a local attorney to draft a formal notice of property rights. We didn't rush it. I wanted everything airtight, every reference and plat map perfect. Meanwhile, I went about my days like nothing had changed. I waved to the same HOA board members who loved to patrol past my house, watched them point out invisible flaws on other people's lawns, and pretended not to notice the way their eyes lit up every time they spotted a new violation of process. They were so convinced of their supremacy, so wrapped up in their own self-importance, that they never once paused to consider that the very ground under their tires might not belong to them. When the notice was finally ready, I had it delivered to the HOA office by certified mail and also emailed copies to every board member. It was polite but firm, outlining in explicit legal terms that I was the sole owner of the only ingress and egress road serving our entire subdivision. The letter further clarified that while I had previously allowed unrestricted use of the road out of neighborly goodwill, recent actions by the HOA, namely the excessive fines and threats of foreclosure, had caused me to reevaluate that arrangement. It concluded by inviting them to enter into a formal road use agreement that would spell out rights, responsibilities, and, if necessary, compensation for continued access. The reaction was immediate and almost comical. Within 24 hours, the board president called me personally, his voice noticeably strained, trying to sound cordial but tripping over his words. He danced around the main issue, asking vague questions about what this really meant for the community, as if hoping I might reassure him that it was all a misunderstanding. I simply referred him back to the letter and suggested they consult their legal counsel. By the next day, I spotted board members huddled on the sidewalk with a stack of papers, gesturing anxiously up and down the road. That weekend, a couple of HOA loyalists who had previously avoided me like the plague suddenly stopped by under the guise of being concerned neighbors, asking how I was doing and whether there was anything they could help with. The shift was so transparent, it was almost insulting, like they thought a few forced smiles could undo months of silent complicity while the board ran roughshod over me. Meanwhile, cars still flowed freely on the road, but now every passing vehicle seemed a little slower, a little more cautious, as if the entire neighborhood sensed something had changed. I didn't make threats or close the road off. I didn't need to. The mere realization that their absolute authority rested on ground they didn't own sent the board into quiet panic. They were suddenly very aware that their power was built on assumptions, not on solid ground. The dynamic flipped practically overnight, not because I shouted or caused a scene, but simply because I proved I held the real leverage all along, buried not in HOA bylaws, but in the dusty old deeds sitting quietly in my filing cabinet. Once the board fully grasped the situation, the entire mood of the neighborhood changed in a way that was almost tangible. Before, the HOA had moved through the streets with a sort of smug, unchallenged confidence. Their patrols were casual, even jaunty at times, clipboards bouncing at their sides, as they pointed out infractions and snapped photos of mailboxes that were supposedly one shade too bright or lawn ornaments placed an inch too close to the curb. But after my letter arrived, after they understood, I legally controlled the only way in and out of this subdivision. Their usual swagger all but evaporated. Suddenly, their vehicles slowed to a crawl when passing my house. Windows rolled up tight, eyes forward like they hoped not to draw attention. The same compliance officers who had once made a point of stopping at the end of my driveway to jot down mysterious notes now drove by without even glancing in my direction. It was as if they believed that by refusing to make eye contact, they could somehow undo the fact that their authority rested on a literal foundation they didn't own. Not long after my attorney's notice, the HOA president and 2 board members requested a meeting with me. They didn't send a formal letter this time, just a neighborly knock on the door late on a Saturday morning. I could tell by their tight, rehearsed smiles and awkward shifting from foot to foot that this was no social call. When I invited them inside, they hovered in the foyer, not quite comfortable enough to sit, probably hoping to keep the conversation quick and steer it back into their familiar territory of gentle intimidation. They started by complimenting my landscaping, the same flower beds they'd previously threatened to fine me over, then moved awkwardly to how this situation with the road has caused a lot of concern among residents. They spoke in vague, conciliatory tones, trying to coax me into simply assuring them I had no intentions of interfering with anyone's access. One board member kept glancing at a small folder in his hand, likely filled with half-prepared proposals or talking points that no longer seemed so convincing. When I didn't immediately reassure them, the HOA president's mask slipped a little. He began tiptoeing around questions of liability, hinting at how it might reflect poorly on everyone if, say, an emergency vehicle ever faced complications. I calmly reminded him that until recently, they hadn't shown the slightest interest in who owned the road. They were perfectly happy to fine, threaten, and degrade me under the assumption that they held all the cards. It was only now, confronted with the reality that their entire community infrastructure depended on property they didn't control, that they seemed eager to foster goodwill. A few days later, the shift became even clearer. I received an official letter from the HOA, starkly different in tone from every past communication, gone with the threatening references to liens and foreclosure. Instead, the letter opened by recognizing my valuable contribution to the community and proposed entering into a formal road maintenance and access agreement. They were quick to promise that the HOA would cover all upkeep expenses and liability insurance, hoping to secure uninterrupted use for residents. The board wasn't the only group scrambling to adjust. Word spread fast, faster than when they first plastered my supposed violations on community bulletins and whispered about my reckless disregard for the rules. Neighbors who had shunned me outright, crossing the street to avoid even polite conversation, now found excuses to stop by when I was out front. They'd make small talk about the weather or compliment my rose bushes, as if trying to build a bridge over the months of pointed silence and awkward sidelong glances. Some dropped by with cookies or homemade bread, transparent attempts to soften old tensions and reestablish favor with the person who quite literally held the keys to their continued peace of mind. The HOA members who used to puff themselves up at meetings now avoided discussing violations with the same zeal they once enforced them. I'd see them at gatherings, nervously scanning for my reaction whenever topics like assessments or compliance fees came up. They'd offer stiff nods and half-hearted waves across the street, as though eager to appear friendly but wary of overstepping. Even the local landscaper, who had once canceled a small job out of fear of getting caught up in HOA mess, stopped by to assure me he'd be happy to handle any future projects. Watching this transformation unfold offered a quiet, satisfying sort of vindication. They had strutted through the neighborhood so sure of their untouchable power, assuming their rules were the final word on every aspect of our lives. But in the end, it only took a few old documents, a handful of recorded deeds, and one well-timed legal notice to unravel that illusion. The HOA that once paraded its control so boldly now found itself in the uncomfortably vulnerable position of needing my cooperation, every bit as dependent on me as they once expected me to be on them. Not long after the dust settled on my formal notice, the real reversal began to unfold. It started quietly, no dramatic announcements or neighborhood-wide statements from the HOA, just a subtle, almost embarrassed pivot in how they approached me. The same board that once flooded my mailbox with threats now tiptoed around every interaction with a nervous courtesy that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Instead of form letters accusing me of noncompliance, I started receiving carefully worded notes inviting me to collaborate on community interests, dressed up in formal pleasantries that couldn't quite mask the undercurrent of desperation. The first official meeting to negotiate the road use agreement happened in my living room. They arrived with their legal counsel in tow, who kept adjusting his glasses and shuffling through a thick binder of documents like he was hoping some overlooked loophole might magically appear to give them back their leverage. The HOA president tried to set a friendly tone, talking about how we're all neighbors here, while the treasurer, the same man who once smirked through reciting my fines, sat rigid and tight-lipped, avoiding my eyes. Their proposal was straightforward. They wanted a permanent easement guaranteeing the community unfettered use of the road, with the HOA assuming all maintenance costs and carrying liability insurance, so I'd never be on the hook if someone got in an accident or if emergency vehicles needed passage. They also offered a modest annual fee in recognition of the fact that their entire community's access rested on my privately owned land. It was a stunning contrast to the arrogant posture they'd held before, when they acted like their bylaws were the supreme law of the land, and my opinions were nothing more than nuisances to swat aside. It was almost entertaining to watch how careful they were now. Every word measured, every sentence ending in some appeal to mutual benefit. They knew full well that if I wanted to, I could erect a gate or start charging a toll, or at the very least, make life so logistically and legally complicated that it would drive property values into the ground. I had no intention of being that vindictive, but it was clear they weren't eager to gamble on discovering where my boundaries lay. After so many months of them treating me like a rebellious child who needed punishing, the sudden shift was stark. The power dynamic had flipped completely. Neighbors who once pretended not to see me when I stepped onto my porch were now all smiles, waving from across the street or stopping by with awkward small talk that danced around the real reason for their renewed friendliness. Some even ventured tentative apologies in roundabout ways. Remarks like, "I guess these HOA things get a little out of hand sometimes," or, "You know how folks are about rules, it's nothing personal." Even the HOA patrols changed their routine. Instead of lingering in front of my house, taking pictures of imaginary infractions, they sped by with obvious discomfort. The board stopped sending compliance inspectors to my property altogether. They didn't want to risk stirring up any friction that might make me reconsider how generous I was willing to be about road access. Their entire strategy became one of cautious deference, like they were handling something fragile that might shatter if pressed too hard. The ripple effect went deeper than just the board or my immediate street. At the next annual HOA meeting, I attended purely to observe. It was almost amusing how deferential they were, offering me a chair near the front, greeting me with strained enthusiasm. When typical agenda items came up, things like landscaping guidelines and fence heights, there was noticeably less bluster from the board. Homeowners asked sharper questions, and the board answered them with a humility that hadn't existed before. It seemed my situation had reminded them all, quite vividly, that power isn't always absolute, and that sometimes the people they assume are powerless have cards tucked away they never bothered to consider. Meanwhile, the board sent out a new newsletter to the community. Instead of their usual stern lectures about compliance, it was full of breezy language about fostering neighborly cooperation and maintaining open dialogue for shared success. They included a small note thanking local property owners for their ongoing support of community infrastructure. It was transparently aimed at me, a kind of public olive branch disguised as a generic thank you. The same HOA that once threatened to seize my home was now printing glossy pamphlets, effectively acknowledging how much they relied on my goodwill. What struck me most was how quickly people's loyalties and attitudes could swing. The same neighbors who once avoided my gaze now praised how gracious I was for working out an agreement that kept everything running smoothly. They seemed to forget entirely how eagerly they'd watched the HOA come after me, how little sympathy they'd shown when I was drowning in fines and public embarrassment. Their selective memories didn't bother me much. If anything, it highlighted just how fragile the facade of these tightly controlled communities really was, how easily the lines between who holds power and who must submit can blur, or even flip entirely, when someone finally stands up and reveals the true lay of the land.